Page 44, continued para. The Chinese account establishes a significant link between the breakdown of slavery and emergence of serfdom. Speaking of donations to the Buddhist monasteries, it points out that human beings are not sold in the 5 Indies, FI capital, and adds that there are no female slaves. Although the statement reminds us of the one made by Megasthenes that there were no slaves in India, it implies that there were some male slaves in the 7th century. But the absence of slavery in general did not raise any difficulty because, quote, villages and their inhabitants could be donated if wanted and necessary, unquote. Since inhabitants were transferred to the monasteries for cultivating the villages granted to them, the beneficiaries did not experience any lack of labor power, para. There are some indications that from the Gupta period, the number of slaves engaged in production declined, and the Sudras became increasingly free from the obligation to serve as slaves. Kautilya's provisions for manumission of slaves generally apply to those who are born of Aryan parents or are Aryan themselves, 287. But Yagnavalkya introduces a revolutionary principle when he asserts that nobody can be reduced to slavery without his consent, 288. According to a later commentary, this means that a Shudra, a Kshatriya or Vaishya, employed in servile work against his will shall be released by the king, 289. Thus, Yagnavalkya completely reverses Manu's precept, which provides for the forcible enslavement of a Shudra, 290. Further, Narada and Brihaspati strongly deprecate the attitude of the wretch, WRETCH, who, being independent, sells himself, 291. Besides this, for the first time, Narada lays down detailed ceremonies for the emancipation of slaves, 292. A passage of Katyayana implies that the slaves had some sort of organization, for their leaders were known as virgins, VARGINS, 293. All these causes may have undermined the institution of slavery. Para. A significant factor which contributed to this development was the fragmentation of land through the process of partition and gift. The earlier laws of inheritance, including those in the law book of Manu, 45 page, and even in that of Yagnavalkya, never refer to the partition of landed property which is mentioned for the first time in the codes of Narada, 294, and Brihaspati, 295. This may suggest that in the middle or towards the end of the Gupta period, large joint families owning large stretches of land began to break into smaller units. Once the principle of the partition of land was recognized, the increasing density of population in the fertile river valleys of northern India after the earlier phases of settlement was bound to accelerate the pace of the fragmentation of arable plots of land. The pressure of population on land is indicated by an epigraphic record of the 5th century AD, which shows that in northern Bengal even 1.5 Kuliya Vapa, KULYAVAPA of land had to be purchased in smaller plots at 4 different places, 296. This purchase was made for the purpose of making gifts, which further helped the process of fragmentation. Para. There was some restriction on making gifts by private individuals. The Bengali inscriptions show that no sale transactions made for the purposes of gifts could be effected without the consent of the local representatives of the king and the district council. The Maharashtra inscriptions also show that gifts of land could not be made by individuals without the consent of the state. But ordinarily, in both cases, such consent was not withheld, with the result that villages and plots of land were granted not only by the king and his feudatories, but also by private individuals. Para. We no longer hear of large plots of 500 karishas or of the state farms of the Maurya period. Epigraphic references to fields of 1 kulia vapa or of 4, 2.5 and 1.5 drona vapas 297 do not suggest big plots. According to Parchitter, a kulia vapa was a little larger than an acre, 298. But if the Kulia Vapa measure of land prevalent in the Kachar district of Assam be considered identical with the Kulia Vapa 299, the area of the latter would be 13 acres. Since 1 kulia is equal to 8 dronas, on this basis a drona vapa will be even less than 2 acres. During the same period, a survey of the land grants made by the Maitraka rulers of Balavi in Gujarat shows that the average plot of land did not exceed 2 or 3 acres in size, 300. Naturally, smaller holdings made it uneconomical to employ a large number of slaves and laborers. Page 46. While some may have been engaged in 2s or 3s, others may have been dispensed with. Para. The traditional view that the Vaishyas were peasants recurs in the literature of post-Maurya and Gupta times, 301. In the Amarakosha, words for cultivators are listed in the Vaishya Varga, section 302. But there is some reason to believe that Shudras were also becoming peasants in good numbers. Several law books show that land was rented out to the Shudra for half the crop. 303. This would suggest that the practice of granting land to Shudra sharecroppers was growing more common. A Pallava land grant of about AD 250 to 350 informs us that 4 sharecroppers, Aradhika, remained attached to the land even when it was given away to the Brahmanas, 304. It is likely that these were Shudras. Para. Narada includes the Kinasa, Kinasa, peasant, among those who are not fit to be examined as witnesses, 305. A commentator of the 7th century AD, 306, explains this term as a Shudra, 307, which shows that peasants were thought of as Shudras. Brihaspati provides very severe corporal punishment for the Sudra who acts as a leader in boundary disputes relating to fields, 308, which again suggests that such Shudras were owners of fields. Finally, Sivan Sang describes the Sudras as a class of agriculturists, 309, a description which is confirmed by the Narasimha Purana, 310, compiled before the 10th century AD. Thus, this significant development, which began from Gupta times, covered all the Shudras by the first half of the 7th century AD. The view that the farmer population was largely composed of Sudras, 311, seems to be more true of the Gupta and post-Gupta periods than of earlier times. Thus, from the point of view of the rise of feudalism, the transformation of Shudras from the position of slaves and hired laborers into that of agriculturists should be regarded as a factor of great significance. Para. It seems that Shudra peasants did not take kindly to the grants made to the Brahmanas. A grant of the middle of the 6th century AD from the district of Gaya lays down that it should be protected from the hands of the Shudras, as can be inferred from the phrase Shudrakare AD Rakshu anna used there. 312. As usual, the donor instructs his descendants as well as others not to interfere with or disturb the grantee, but what is unique, he also points out the necessity of protecting the grant from the Shudras, page 47. Thus, in this case, danger to the grant was apprehended from both above and below. Since the crucial expression is not found in any later grant, it seems that gradually the idea of spiritual merit accruing from religious grants was propagated among the peasants, who thus became reconciled to them. Para. Feudal developments in medieval Europe were characterized by the rise of independent, self-sufficient economic units, which also arose in India as the result of land grants and certain other factors. The beneficiaries enjoyed several economic rights which cut the economic ties between the central authority and the donated areas. For the continuity and development of their economy, they were more dependent on the local artisans and cultivators than on the officials of the central government. The beneficiaries were entitled to all kinds of local dues, a part of which they must have invested in local undertakings. The main idea behind tying down the peasants to the fields they cultivated was to preserve the self-sufficient village economy, which was maintained in South Bihar through other ways. The two spurious copper plates of Samudragupta, assignable to the 7th/8th century, required the Doni Agraharika not to introduce any tax-paying peasants and artisans from another village into the gift villages. 313. Exempt from various royal taxes and impositions, these villages were a standing temptation to the neighboring villagers, who naturally wanted to migrate to the Agraharas. But if such an exodus was tolerated, it would not only deprive the state of revenues, but also disturb the existing economy of the village from which they migrated. Hence, such a restriction served to, quote, maintain the self-sufficient economy of the villages. Para. The conditions obtaining in the villages, which were independent of the beneficiaries of land grants and were placed under the charge of the village headman, were not very dissimilar. We have already seen that the headman, according to the Kama Sutra Vatsyayana, might compel peasant women not only to work in his fields but also to spin yarn so that his clothes might be supplied to him locally. 314. Some of the commodities thus produced were also put on sale, apparently to cater for the simple needs of the villagers. 315. Page 48. So the Maurya state regulation of trade and industries was giving way to the management of these affairs by the chiefs of local production units, independent of the central control. Para. That such local units were coming into existence is also evident from the paucity of coins of common use from the Gupta period onwards. This factor can be linked up on the one hand with the decline of internal trade and the consequent necessity of producing local commodities to meet local needs, 316, and on the other with the weakening of the power of the center, which gradually adopted the method of paying officials by grants of revenues or in kind. While the Indo-Bactrians and especially the Kushanas issued a considerable number of copper coins which were evidently in common use in the Punjab and occasionally are found even as far east as Buxar in Bihar, the Gupta emperors other than Kumaragupta issued only a few copper coins. Thus, Fahian seems to have been correct when he stated that cowries form the common medium of exchange, even allowing for the fact that copper is more susceptible to corrosion than more precious metals. The comparative rarity of Gupta copper coins suggests that money economy was becoming weaker at this time. Para. It is indicative of the growing disuse of coins in post-Gupta times that the religious endowments which were made in cash by the princes and individuals in the first 2 centuries of the Christian era were now partly replaced by grants of land. In the earlier period, the Satavahana rulers made a few land grants, but no such grants can be attributed to the Kushanas in whose dominions, as well as in those of the Satavahanas, cash grants were made to the guilds of artisans and merchants for using them for religious purposes. Further, in the post-Harsha period, hardly any coin can be ascribed with certainty to any ruling house. The only dynasty of the period to which some coins have been attributed is that of the Maitrakas of Vallavi. But according to a careful study, they can be regarded only as quote, so-called unquote Vallavi coins, for they really belong to Gupta times and are clearly comparable to Gupta coins. 317. Of course, legal texts refer to the use of coins. Land charters mention taxes levied in Hiranya, page 49, and some inscriptions speak of the cost of construction and purchase in terms of money. But very few actual finds can be ascribed to this period. In fact, the absence of coins during the period 600 to 900 has been noted by several scholars. 318. It is not possible to make much of references to coins in literary sources, for a recent study shows that most of these sources belong to the period following the 10th century. 319. It is therefore evident that coins in general became rarer from the time of Harshavardhana onwards, which leads us to the conclusion that trade suffered a decline and urban life began to disappear, a feature which can be compared with a similar development in Iran. Para. A recent study of trade and commerce in Gupta time shows that the decline of the Roman Empire and the Persian rivalry with the Byzantine Empire rendered the volume of Indian trade apparently less than in the 1st century AD, when Pliny complains of the heavy drainage of Roman money for Indian merchandise. 320. One of the 2 most important articles of this trade was silk, exported by India through Persian merchants, the other being the spices. 321. Trade in silk was so important in the Byzantine Empire that in order to regulate silk prices all over the country, Justinian 527 to 65 enacted that 1 pound of silk should not cost more than 8 pieces of gold, and that all the wealth of one who violated this law should be confiscated. 322. To further check the drainage of his country's wealth on account of the exorbitant prices paid for silk, to the Persian merchants he proposed to the Ethiopians that they should buy silk from India and sell it to the Romans, for they would thereby gain much profit for themselves and assist the Romans by saving them from having to pay their money to the Persians. 323, who were the rivals of the Byzantine Empire. But the Ethiopians found it impossible to buy the required silk from the Indians, as the Persian merchants in the laborers in the harbors farther to the east, where the Indian ships first put in, bought up whole cargoes, thereby monopolizing the entire supply. 324. It is evident from this that in the first half of the 6th century, silk was as good an earner of bullion for India as spices in the 1st century. The drainage of gold from the Roman Empire in the 1st century AD was stopped by means of legislation, page 50, which, though supplemented by diplomacy, failed to check it in the Byzantine Empire. The solution was found in 551 by the introduction of silkworms brought into the Byzantine Empire secretly overland from China, 325. It may have taken another 50 years to get the art of rearing silkworms spread in Byzantium, and by the end of the 6th century AD, the problem of obtaining silk from the east may have been finally solved for the Byzantine Empire. This adversely affected Indian foreign trade, which, so far as North India is concerned, was confined to silk. Evidently, the stoppage of its export to the Byzantine Empire drastically reduced whatever remained of the shrunken foreign commerce of northwestern India in Gupta times. Hence, so long as some new articles did not take the place of silk, there was no means to restore the balance, and retrogression in foreign trade was inevitable. The decline of foreign trade may also have been caused by the expansion of the Arabs under the banner of Islam. The agitated state of Western Asia, Egypt, and Eastern Europe, at least in the initial stage of the Arab conquest, was bound to tell upon India's foreign trade with the countries lying to the west. As we shall see later, only when the Arabs had settled down as rulers in these countries and Sindh did trade revive from the 3rd century of the Hijri era. But meanwhile, there was nothing to arrest its decline. Thus, we have clear indications of the decline of the foreign commerce of northwestern India from the end of the Gupta period, and especially from the first half of the 7th century AD. To what extent the loss on account of trade with the Byzantine Empire was made up by the diversion of Indian trade with China in the century following the fall of the Gupta Empire is difficult to determine. A Chinese account of the 9th-10th centuries refers to the presence of Indian merchants in China and Chinese merchants in India in the 7th century AD 326. But commerce seems to have been confined to luxury articles, and the use of cowries in internal transactions referred to by this Chinese account could not have helped foreign trade. Whatever internal trade and commerce existed had to be fitted into the emerging feudal structure, page 51. This is evident from the detailed rules laid down in the law books regarding the functioning of the corporate bodies of artisans and traders. It is symptomatic of the declining central authority that the king is required not only to observe the laws of the guilds but also to enforce them. Brihaspati enjoins the king to approve of whatever is done by the heads of the guilds, whether harsh or kind towards other people. 327. What actually prevailed can be inferred from 3 charters ranging from the end of the 6th century AD to the beginning of the 8th century AD, granted to the guilds of merchants by the rules of the coastal areas of western India. The earliest charter, first translated by D.C. Sarkar 328 and later translated and commented upon by D.D. Kosambi 329, throws considerable light on the nature of commodities handled by the merchants. It speaks of the trade in wine, sugar, indigo, ginger, oil, textiles, articles in wood, iron and leather, etc. 330. Here the state regulates prices and checks weights and measures 331, but its control of trade and commerce is not as rigid as prescribed by Kautilya. On the whole, the corporation of merchants is allowed a large measure of autonomy. Exempted from various kinds of dues, the traders are left free to deal with their laborers, herdsmen, etc. 332. They are also empowered to exact forced labor from the blacksmiths, weavers, barbers, potters, and other artisans 333. But the guilds of traders are not permitted to compete with one another, for they cannot congregate in the same market 334. Of course, some artisans cum merchants are required to supply commodities to the state at half the usual rate at which they are sold to ordinary customers 335, and others are asked to render corvée, corvee, in lieu of taxes. Besides, the traders are required to pay to the state a number of frontier taxes, customs and sales tax, but in return they are allowed immunity from the entry of royal officials in their area and the payment of dues and rations for supporting royal officials 336. The state also abandons the power of escheating the property of a sonless merchant, a right given to it by the law book of Brihaspati and exercised by it as known from the Shakuntalam. The privileges conceded to the Vanig-Grama remind us of their counterparts granted to temples and, page 52, Brahmanas from the early centuries of the Christian era and clearly show the rise of autonomous economic units in the coastal areas. Para. We do not have any charter of this kind in the 7th century AD, but the two charters issued by Bhoga Shakti, the Chalukya king of the Konkan area in the beginning of the 8th century AD, make it clear that the guilds of the merchants had gained in importance. They were free to manage their affairs. In one case, 8 villages and money granted to the temple were to be managed by the local merchants in groups of 5 or 10, who were instructed to supervise annual religious processions and were exempted from payment of tolls and rations for royal officers 337. In another case, a deserted town was resettled and granted along with 3 neighboring villages to 2 merchants who were assigned a kind of municipal charter. These merchants were exempted from tolls throughout the kingdom of Bhoga Shakti in perpetuity, and the crown had neither the right to confiscate their property if they died sonless, nor could royal officials enter their house and demand allowances and provisions. 338. Of course, fines were to be imposed on the merchants guilty of sexual and physical offences, but the decision rested with 8 or 16 senior men of the town. 339, para. 3 important points may be noted about these charters. First, the grants were made not to the artisans but to the merchants, among whom a few were elevated to the position of managers of the endowment or the town, as the case might be. The number of such managers coincides with what is recommended by the law book of Brihaspati, according to whom 2, 3 or 5 persons shall be appointed as advisors of the guild. 340. Second, the charters tied down the merchants to the management of villages, which in one case were attached to a temple and in another to the rehabilitated town. The merchants enjoyed practically the same immunities and privileges as were enjoyed by priests and perhaps by some feudal barons in the villages granted to them. But since they were encumbered with the management of villages, they could not give sole attention to their trade and commerce. These charters therefore show the feudalization of merchants by turning them into some kind of landed intermediaries. Third, the activities of every guild were restricted to its locality so that it had no freedom of competition, a feature characteristic of the closed economy in the Middle Ages.